Vicky Linane and welcome to Embrace Therapy podcast. I am a practicing art therapist based in Ireland. In each episode, I will interview guests from various fields of therapy and well-being with the aim to encourage healing through embracing therapy. Hello everyone and welcome to the Embrace Therapy podcast. It's spring finally here in Ireland and I took some time off. Winter is never easy and it's nice to take a slower pace, I guess. So enjoying the ebbs and flows of the seasons and listening to nature and taking some time off. So my last podcast episode was in the month of January. So this is April, so took a good few weeks off there, but I have some lovely podcasts coming up for you in the coming weeks. And today is a really special guest. Her name is Suzie Cahn. She is an art therapist, an eco-psychologist, and she has so many projects and so many plates spinning at the same time. It's just incredible. One of the things that we talk about today is really her passion for climate justice. She has a garden which is a beautiful place. It's called Carraig Dulra. It's an organic farm garden and Permaculture Design business. So she is the Director of Carraig Dulra and she teaches on the farm. Her background as well is quite informed by Steiner education. Suzie also is the host to her own podcast. It's called Cailleach, which is an incredible word. It basically means old woman, but there's a lot more to it, I think, when you really look at the meaning of it. But the podcast that she has is just an opportunity for her to reflect on the life that she's had and reconnecting with Earth. So she's really passionate about nature and our connection to the planet that we live on and not seeing separate from it, to feel like we're all part of it, this system. Suzie is also project director at The Wheel, a non-profit organisation. The Wheel is Ireland's national association of charities, community and voluntary organisations and social enterprises. And not only that, she is project coordinator at Task, a climate justice centre. It's something that she's incredibly passionate about and something we discuss in today's podcast. So, without further ado, here is Suzie Cahn.
It's lovely to be here. Thank you for inviting me along.
It's a pleasure. So I actually came across you back in 2008. You wrote an article, I think it was in the Independent. That was the first time I saw your name and I was like, art therapist. And I started Googling art therapy and was so curious about this. Yeah. And then, at the AGM, the IACAT AGM, you're now an honorary member of IACAT. As an art therapist, we just look up to you, I suppose. So I just want to say that first and foremost. It's an honor to have you on.
Thank you very much. That's a little embarrassing, but thank you.
Oh, it's absolutely amazing to have you on. And not only are you an art therapist, but you have like many hats. You wear many hats. And I'm excited to talk about all of them as much as you'd like. Because I suppose it's really part of my story now as well, that I'm starting to work on a farm and I just really like the way that that's happening organically in my life, and I'm getting more and more passionate about ecology. So I'd love to talk to you about that as well.
Sure. And I guess what is funny is that when you can look back, and I mean, I'm a good bit older than you, and you can see the beginning threads that lead somewhere with your 2020 narrative, that looking backwards narrative, you can see why things evolved where they did. And when I look back, I see influences that are all of the things that are manifested in my life later, and one of the strongest, well, two particular ones, I suppose, are the attachment to and comfort of being in nature as a child, and it being a solace, it being a place of solace when other places in the people world were challenging, but also my exposure as a child through my family connection to the Camphill communities in Northern Ireland. I had my grandmother, and I've talked about this, written a little bit about this in different places, but my grandmother was a founding parent of Camphill in Northern Ireland. So there was the original Steiner-inspired Camphill community in a place called Camphill in Scotland. And my grandmother would be well over 100 if she was alive today. And she had my uncle who was a man with Down syndrome, and they several parents had kind of heard of this Dr. Carl Koenig, who was creating curative education and community space for children with learning disabilities at that time. And my grandmother was a very forthright sort of person in terms of being able to be innovative in her thinking, and she had already integrated my uncle into primary school by insisting he go, and going with my aunt in her class, who was younger than him. And so she and a group of parents went over to Scotland, and then they came back to Northern Ireland, and they started Glencraig, was the first Steiner-based community for children, and a school. And so from very young, I was going up to Glencraig, where there were Steiner events, and that has this integration of kind of culture and art, and also even mythology and seasonality, things like the celebrations of Candlemas, going out and putting in earth candles. It's like digging a little at this time of year. We're in February, in the spring, they'd go up. There was one of the ceremonial sort of things was to go and dig a little hole in the soil and pour in hot wax and a wick, and have earth candles and have a ceremony about the warming earth where the seeds would soon start growing. So I think I had a lot of things in that going in by osmosis. And there was a lot of creative arts therapies in their proto forms, I suppose, within Camphill. So there was forms of expressive dance. There's a thing called eurythmy that was all pieces of beautiful pastel colored silks that was sort of movement, and I'd go to these performances. And then there was biodynamic farming and agriculture, and there was communal living, and the idea of a sort of autonomous space where shared living was happening and equality was happening. So my uncle later as an adult lived in Mourngrange, which is on the border of Kilkeel and the Mourne Mountains. And I'd get sent there. Probably I got sent there a bit because I was by then a teenager and getting up to mischief. And they're like, would you like to go and do this? You seem to like this. You should go there. There was a lot less mischief. The mischief was actually, it became much more innocent in Camphill. We'd be sneaking the clotted cream from the Jersey cows at night with some drinking chocolate stirred in, because that was naughty in that context, whereas things I was getting up to elsewhere were a lot different. But they, what that meant was like my uncle would have moved around the village over his lifetime into different roles. So he worked in a wood shop at one point, he worked in a cafe at another point, and that autonomy of the villagers, who were the people with intellectual disabilities, the care staff, who were called what were they called? They were like my woofers now. They're sort of volunteers who came for a couple of years, co-workers, I think they were called. And then there were house parents, and they had their own children. And so I got this experience throughout my teens of what people would now call an intentional community or an eco-village. But that role of service to more vulnerable people actually creates a cohesion. You don't sweat the small stuff as much if you're in service to those more vulnerable to you. It's not quite the same as maybe a group of very able people creating their intentional community. So that, I think, I look back a lot at the influences of that, of how that, and I wouldn't have known it was influencing me, when I was out being given jobs that I didn't want to do. you know, I wouldn't have necessarily known, and I didn't, but I learned all these things from being around that. My grandmother, about preserving, about growing, about, as I say, that seasonal notion, and things like how to make your own yogurt. It was just stuff I knew. So I think it wasn't till later I went to art college in Limerick in the 1980s, and I joke about this, I call that my den of iniquity years.
I love it.
Because Limerick in the 1980s, Ireland in the 1980s was it's for you, Vicky, it's such an unimaginable difference. It's so hard to describe how it was different. And it was different economically. It was extremely different for women,
A lot of oppression, isn't there? Like
incredibly oppressive time, incredibly oppressive for women. And yet in art college, there was people who thought a little bit differently or didn't fit in or had their quirks, and were maybe, I would say, if I was going to use modern language that younger people than me know very, very well, I would say there was a lot of non-cisgendered, non-neurotypical people in art college in those days. And also people in the queer community, and the rest of those people in Ireland had left. So I kind of say they either went to the UK, to the States, to Sydney, to wherever, or they went to art college. So it was its own culture, it was its own place in the 1980s. It had, I use that term again, it had a kind of autonomous space quality to it, and it was full of rebellion. One point I was part of leading an occupation of the art college. We did like the Occupy movement, like there was a lot of activism, there was a lot of angst, and there was a lot of misery, because there was not a culture of help, there was not a culture of talking about any of your problems. There was psychiatry, there was barely psychology, and it was very institutionalized. And so when I did 2 years of art college, and I was burned out in every measure. I had run out of funds. I was exhausted from all the mischief I was getting up to, relational things. It just none of it was healthy. It was all expressive. It was all a kind of acting out and exploring, and having the art alongside of that as part of that journey was vital. And I would say was the ingredient of survival in my life, in my young life, was trying to explore something and understand something, and encountering actually a very influential artist that I met when I in the second 2 years, which I'll talk about in a sec, but was Dorothy Cross, who was the only female tutor in the sculpture program. Yeah, and it was very male dominated across the art college anyway. But Dorothy came in the second 2 years, and that opened things a bit for me. But I was already opening them in other ways too. So yeah, so that's kind of what that brings you up to kind of my encounter with art, and then that thread of nature being back then as well.
It's amazing because we can't separate ourselves from our environment, and it's like your environment has been so influential and is continually to intertwine with your art practice, and I suppose the activism part as well. Like it's just embedded in who you are.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that term is one that I think about a lot. The idea of the weaving, the idea of threads of your life, and the spinning of yarn, and the telling of tales like we're doing now, in the storytelling, because it's a constant ongoing integration. It's not a fixed state that you get somewhere and you get out of, one cycle of growth and you're done. And actually, if you were, that's kind of stasis in nature. Something that's static is dead. So the to be growing, you're cellular changing, you're evolving, you're remaking yourself constantly at different stages and ages and development that is pushing you forward. And a bit like the body healing, I would say, you can get, a cut, an injury, a break, and there is incredible energy in your body to try to fix that, and it will go for it. It will try so hard to immediately seal over a wound or any of those things. And depending on the circumstances and the conditions you create for that, if you're sick and you try to keep pushing it and you don't go to bed and you don't hydrate, or you have a wound that's very severe and you have an open wound and a scar and you keep knocking it and you keep
Yeah.
opening it up again, or somebody else does, or somebody bashes you, it's all of those things. But there's just such a life force within us to survive in our bodies. And I would see the same thing in psychological growth, that the impulse is there. There can be so many conditions that don't support it. There could be so many environment, as you say, that has so much influence, but the impulse doesn't go away. The survival, instinct to try and find the right environment in which to grow, in which to do better in your life with, health and healing. Um, and I think that, like my metaphor of the wound, you can be re-wounded psychologically. You can have trauma repetitively. You can have multiple complex bereavement. You can have all sorts of things in this life that are incredibly challenging and hard to survive. But the impulse to try, and so I guess what started to happen for me was getting interested in. I took a year off art college to recover
Yeah.
my funds and my well-being. I kind of knew I needed to stop, and so I went, and my first environment, I guess, of that 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 challenge between like leaving school, being out on my own, being in an Ireland that wasn't a healthy place for young women. That when I went to the States and I worked in a family as a au pair,
Oh,
and
gorgeous.
it was an incredibly different environment. So
Mm.
you're talking about the influence, suddenly I was in a completely different country. There was different, even just how young people were spoken to was different. In the 1980s, it was not considered a good thing by many, many people, teachers, through education, lots of elders. There are plenty of exceptions, but it was not considered a good thing to ever praise someone.
Yes.
So children weren't praised, young
Yes.
people weren't praised, and if you did have ideas, because it was such a harsh environment, if you had innovation, if you wanted to try something out, people would generally try very hard to tell you all the knocks and hardship you would have. And they were really just trying compassionately to prepare you. But of course, if you're 18 and you want to do something and people are going, oh, I don't know, you'll not be able to make a living at that, or you'll never manage that, or there's going to be obstacles to that. They were real. They were telling us real things, but definitely it would have been hard to withstand that. Whereas in the States, it was
Dream big.
it was the opposite, and it was
Yeah.
comically the opposite, but it was the opposite. So for a young person getting the no, go for it, and you're amazing at this, and you'd be like, how are you complimenting me? I'm Irish. Stop that. Don't be talking to me like that.
Exactly.
So that shook things up quite a bit for me, and
Yeah.
that helped a lot. And I went back and finished the 2 years, and that was a very different 2 years where I had tapped back in, I suppose, to the love of helping other people, the love of children. I had worked with children in different ways, over the years, and other stuff. And I guess activism started having maybe, an interaction with a theoretical underpinning of some
Yeah.
kind.
Yeah.
I wasn't really reading stuff, but I was starting to meet feminists. I was starting to meet, like I said, Dorothy Cross, other people who were older and wiser and more educated, or more experienced through lived experience. And they were kind of giving me that there was maybe a tribe out there of
Mm.
women and others who were trying to address stuff. So I ended up volunteering in the Limerick Rape Crisis Centre through those sorts of thoughts and connections. And that really is the actual beginning to my art therapy journey. Because this will tell you how, to give you just a hint of an example of how different it was in 1980s Ireland. The Limerick Rape Crisis Centre were run as volunteer centres. There was a network across Ireland, and they had no professional therapists or psychologists except in Dublin, I believe.
Okay.
And we did a 6-evening training So 6 weeks, 6 evenings in basically kind of Rogerian based
Oh,
therapy, in the sense that they didn't call it that, but it was basically listen,
mhm.
don't judge, reflect back what you hear, pay attention to the emotion.
Yeah. Wow.
That was it. And
Go.
I would, yeah, and go. And I would still stand over the work, because that creating the space. So here I was, a 21-year-old, sitting beside people whose lived experiences had been phenomenal and traumatic. And I was listening. I was believing. I wasn't judging. I didn't have a lot to say, but I would reflect back to them what I heard, and I would pay attention to their emotions. And that work was, in the absence, especially of there being any other form of help, was really empowering. But the context was that those women were not being believed by guards, by judges, by psychiatrists, by any other profession. They were not being believed. And so the lid was just beginning to come off the whole abuse cycle that, into the 90s, the church, everything was coming, but this was literally, just ahead of that. And it was, so that's the context in which women experience the world. We're not going to be believed about any of our experiences. We're not going to be believed about our traumas, and the men rule, and the men are in all the positions of power.
Yeah.
And so that was, to be a youth in that, you
Yes.
kind of, you kind of can't help but find some place
Yeah.
that you're either going to leave it, or you're going to be privileged enough to ignore it in some way. Maybe you've got other privileges that help you navigate it. But I certainly couldn't. I had great supportive parents and family, but I couldn't ignore.
Yeah.
And I suppose, just to say that I came from Northern Ireland from when I was 12 and moved to the south. So I'd already had some priming of the pump of different identities and different, I'd had a shake up about what the adults believed
Okay.
from
Yeah.
very young. I
Yeah.
had one set of beliefs and traditions around me in the north, and then I'd experienced, at age 12, a completely different set of
Yeah.
traditions, and that did shake up. Oh, like, what adults believe might not be true,
Yeah.
from 12. So
Wow.
I suppose that is another influence of questioning things and saying, is there another way, and can we help each other? That was kind of it. Is there another way, and can I help myself, and can I help other people? so
It's,
so I went back and studied art therapy after that in the States, because I heard, and literally because I heard the words art and therapy, a bit like you, and I
yes.
went, that appears to be the two things that I'm up to now.
Yeah.
I had no idea what it was.
Yes. And only for me as well, finding Dibs in Search of Self, that book, I wouldn't have known there was a career as such in it. So yeah, play therapy and art therapy, just it's the start of it all for me. Yeah. That is just fascinating because, I know you went on to study in the States, and I really want to talk about that as well. But I suppose everything that you're saying, it's like that passion for your environment and your people, and the two just aren't going to be separate for you. It's like we are our environment, but the people are just as much a part of that. And I think that's just, it's just incredible, to think that's the way you started it all off for yourself.
Well, I suppose there's one piece, and I've talked about this on my own podcast, because I
Yeah.
did a kind of thread on my identity, and one of the pieces that I've talked about sometimes is that I was a slow learner, would have been the terminology back then. That's as much as you got as a term, and a slow developer. Now you can get into all sorts of developmental stuff, and I can interpret and understand that in different ways now. But what that meant was I was very slow to talk, and I was very slow to read, and I struggled a lot in primary school. And one of the things that did as well, and another sort of state that I was always in from very young, from like a tiny child, was the daydream state.
Oh yeah.
And that was attempted to be knocked out of me, and it was, very strongly criticized. And Susie's away with the fairies is the phrase that I tell people. But what that actually meant was I really was away with the fairies. I was hanging out with them and talking to them, and the fairies were the nature spirits of my world as a child. And I talked and communicated with the sea, and I talked to the plants down the bottom of the garden and the bugs under rocks. And so I very much was away with the fairies. And one of the things that I realized in later life was that that protected me from a form of colonization in my education.
Yeah.
So that worldview that I didn't actually find again in my contemporaries in Ireland for many, many years, but I found elsewhere in the world was an indigenous worldview. I didn't see any separation between myself and nature. I didn't have boundaries between myself and nature. I wasn't mechanicizing my view of the natural world because I wasn't able to be taught well in the system. And so I didn't really separate that, and I didn't experience it that way. So I couldn't understand it that way. And, lots of that would have been assuming that was part of my stupidity. Like I would have thought, oh, I just don't understand things that other people understand. So it was much later that I realized the opposite was actually true. I understood things that many people didn't, but that there were other people in the world that had that worldview, that had that non-distinct. So, and the reason I kind of needed to find those, my other, like I needed, and it was a need to find people who had a different experience of nature was that, and it's what kind of made me what people consider me as an environmentalist. And I don't really consider myself an environmentalist in the same context. I understand why that would fit with things that I'm involved with, but it was more that from childhood on and still today, if I basically experienced, if nature was being hurt, I experienced it bodily.
Yeah.
That I was being hurt. Like the lack of separation is significant because you experience it fully. And so I couldn't understand that, and I couldn't understand why anyone else was doing what they were doing to nature. It took me, from childhood, it took me years to really so I understood first people trauma.
Yeah.
And I had no language to talk. I had plenty of language to talk about that, especially as I studied art therapy, and I think that there's a connection there because indigenous healing and indigenous worldview uses the arts and ritual and liminal spaces and otherworld and fairy world. And I think that that was the draw to arts therapies, is that it isn't a medicalized model of health. And it, when I first had my first children, I was breastfeeding my eldest, and there was still a medicalized model of feeding babies and childbirth. And so that's sort of the context in which I couldn't have found a more holistic model, because it was very, very subverted. If it existed, it was in the margins, it was very much in the periphery. And so I didn't find those people in Ireland for much later, but I was really drawn to indigenous story, indigenous wisdom from a child. I was very, and I used to try to think through my teens when I tried to think, but what would the natural way of doing a thing be?
Wow, brilliant.
And then when I had my children, I used to think that I'm being told this and that and the other, but what would the natural way be if I hadn't had this contamination of a colonized capitalist culture? What would it have turned out like? And I'm still asking those questions through development, because what we consider even to be norm for a teenager, and my own teenagers have thrown that back at me and say, why would this be normal? What's happened in our culture that we consider these things to be teenage norms? So I think there's a lot we have to revisit. And but that's sort of where those influences are in my life. Why I'm revisiting them is because of that childhood connection, and losing it through some of my young adult life, but then being in a return journey from from my 20s. That was the beginning of a kind of the turmoil of my own teens, and those kind of crazy years, and then trying to reintegrate it all into my own life.
Yeah. And I suppose then when you came back from your training, how did you land here in Ireland? Like, did you decide I'm going to find a job and work my way up, or
Well, I've never been working my way up in my life. In fact, the minute I start appearing to go up, I seem to disrupt that pattern because the way up, not sure about that. But no, what I did do was I came back to Ireland. I had brought my American husband back with me in 1991 and went looking for other arts therapists. And, it was such an established profession in the States, and it was an established master's. The master's included a placement in the first year, and the second year you were out working in an internship on a 20-hour-a-week practical, internship. So I had been working with kids out of Harlem that were in multiple breakdown of foster care and, a lot of trauma and abuse and gun crime, all that, drugs, lots of stuff. I came back to Ireland. That didn't exist here yet. We didn't have that. The drugs were coming in through the 80s, but the multiple generational losses and the high volume of foster care, like that actually didn't exist then. So I came back into Ireland and worked in residential care. I couldn't find jobs there was no such thing as a job advertised as an art therapist. There were eight of us in the creative arts in Ireland at the time. There were 4 art therapists, a couple of drama therapists, music therapists, and a dance movement therapist. So it became very obvious early on that we should all work together. It was like, if it was going to be like, oh, the dance movement therapist is going to have an association of one, that wouldn't work. So we collaborated. We met with we went looking, myself and Jim Cosgrove, who were both from Northern Ireland originally, went looking for creative arts therapists from Northern Ireland, and we started to help and support each other's professional development, because there was no one more experienced than us in the south. There was in the north, and we basically had that created a condition of a challenge that then resulted in a lot of collaboration. And I think that happens in what we've just seen in the pandemic. If you go through crisis times as in group form, the best way to survive that is through collaboration. And we know that the opposite is true, that oppression is through separation and division, and that every dictatorship in the world stops people meeting. It's the first thing they do is ban meetings. So to realize that we've gone through that and need to come together on shared challenges is, that's something that is a continual thread and a very current thread in my life now.
And being chair of IACAT at one time, I'm sure your aspirations of an All Ireland was even part of that dialogue too, then, as chair.
Well, certainly the cross-island collaboration with people who have different experiences, different traditions, and definitely different jurisdictions. And a lot of the creative arts therapists in the north at that time would have been members of BAT, the British Association of Art Therapists. They would have been recognised health professions. There were posts, there were pay scales. So we had lessons to learn from Britain that were available for us to learn through our collaboration in Northern Ireland. And I think that's a really, it's these islands that we practice on. And we've looked to Britain several times as an association when trying to get art therapies to be a registered health profession in the south. And we've had help from a union that had been part of a negotiation in the UK, because of the volume in Scotland, England, Wales, and Northern Ireland. There's many, many, many more creative arts therapists that exist. So to find ways to find each other and support each other's development, and then of course we were bringing our own fresh thinking, for being the newbies and being young, and we brought these ideas of collaborative workshops for our CPD, and in Northern Ireland they were all arts therapists, and so we were kind of showing up with drama therapists, music therapy, and doing collaborative workshops. And so I think it's like, I just think working together in as non-hierarchical a way as possible actually is really helpful to everybody's growth. It kind of, I think isn't the Ubuntu philosophy of Africa that if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, you go together.
Yeah, I've seen beautiful illustrations of that as well. It's a beautiful one, and it really lands. But yeah, currently, as a member of IACAT and on the council at the moment, we're constantly talking about this, and we're trying to link in with BATA, the British Association of Drama Therapists as well.
Yes.
And it's beautiful to make those links and connections, and just really pull on each other's resources, and to reestablish again that narrative of like, we're not registered still in the South.
Yes. Yeah.
And how important that is.
Absolutely. Well, I guess so the nature connection to this for me is I ended up getting very involved in the regenerative farming, permaculture, ecosystem, ecology kind of understandings of the world. And that idea, when you can see an ecosystem, you realize there's constant inputs and outputs, there's constant relationships that make for a much more resilient ecosystem. It's so that fragmentation in the human system, if you're separated from each other and you're not collaborating, you have a weakness in your system. Like if you want to regenerate soil and land and degraded forest, or anything that has been degenerated through whatever management practices, the thing that you do to be generative is the same thing that you do to be generative in health and well-being, is the same thing that you be generative in organizations and society and community. It is reestablish relationships and healthy relationships and remove blockages to the establishment of relationships. So I really think like an ecosystem now. That's kind of how I have a language for it that I didn't have as the child. And so it's all connected. And I suppose that's why, although sometimes my work can seem to others a little disconnected from different things, for me it's always all connected, because I can see it in a pattern in the ecosystem. I can see where the relationships of art and nature and sustainable land use and community, and I can see how they're all connected.
You really are a weaver then. That's just amazing. You're getting all these threads and weaving them. That's so beautiful.
And also, I'm just one of the nodes. Like the strength is not me. The strength is that I'm connected to all these other strong nodes, in the web.
Beautiful. And I'm obviously doing this podcast, and you're, well-established podcaster now as well. You've not only had your own like personal one, which is just beautiful, and I'm afraid that I'm going to butcher the word, but is it Cailleach? That's how you say it? No.
Well, it's Cailleach or Cailleach. Cailleach. It's the Irish for a witch or an old lady, and I kind of call it myself a baby elder. So it was sort of my beginning to try to harvest some of my life into what wisdom I can gain from experience. So Cailleach is what I call it. Yeah, so Cailleach.
It's really lovely, like reflecting on a life of reconnecting with the earth, and it's just really worth a listen.
Thank you very much.
As well as that, then you're starting off on this new podcast journey, and for anyone listening, I think everybody would be really interested to pick up where you're going to be.
Well, yes, this is part of a new piece of work that I'm doing with the Wheel, which is the umbrella organisation for the community voluntary sector in the South, and NICVA, who are the umbrella organisation for the voluntary sector in the North, who've always collaborated a bit like we did as art therapists, and there are funding, at the moment for peace and reconciliation work that's always been ongoing. And basically, I'm working on a project to convene people in the community and voluntary sector in all parts of the island, in the Northern Irish jurisdiction in the Republic, to talk to each other about their shared challenges and about the shared opportunities. So as part of that, this time the subject is definitely not Suzie Cahn's reflections on life. It is trying to bring together practitioners, idea thinkers, artists, creatives, all sorts of people from public life and community and voluntary life. And we are creating a new podcast that will be launched in May. And if people are interested to find out more about that, they can keep an eye on the iCommunity project in the Wheel, or in NICFA if you're in Northern Ireland. And we'll be certainly flooding the social media, the communications to launch it. And we hope to have some high profile guests, but we also hope to have many people giving us their experiences in the community and voluntary sector about their shared challenges. And it's loosely around 5 themes, how we're going to make our island sustainable, and the sustainable development goals. How are we, because these are all of our challenges, how are we going to make just recovery part of COVID recovery and part of just transition? How are we going to work with the multi-generational trauma of our islands, and how are we going to work with health and well-being and mental health? So there are all the kinds of challenges that we face, whether biodiversity, which doesn't understand that we have different jurisdictions and traditions, and the birds fly across the fish swim around our island. So how do we work together to regenerate and to deal with the biodiversity crisis and so on? So those are going to be the conversations with a lot of different people, and it'll hopefully be out on the airways in May.
Oh, I really look forward to that. It sounds very nourishing to even listen to it and to see what role you can play a part in it as well. It's just lovely. And right now, I know this is part of your life currently, that you have an organic farm, Carraig Dulra. Is that how you say? Yeah,
that's right. So at Carraig Dulra is where we collaborate with a lot of other educators to create a space, and also the land itself is a space. We have homeschool village that come up there and forest schools, but we use the site Carraig Dulra as part of kind of more of a wider collective there, where we put together a permaculture design course on site there, and connected to other sites that we do site visits and so on. That happens every year. If people are interested in that, they can find that on Dulra, which is the Irish for Nature, DULRA.org, and they can find more information about that.
Gorgeous. Thank you so much for your time, and I really appreciate you coming on, and hopefully it's not the last time. We might get you back on again sometime. Thank you
Vicky,
so much,
it's my
Suzie.
pleasure. Good luck with
Take care.
it.
Bye.